Thank you all for joining us today. I want to start by asking Kieran and any of the other historians or art historians out there, whether you ever find your research frustrating. Anyone? Well, the research I want to share with you today has been frustrating for me. And that's because, in the immortal words of a great Irish philosopher, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. So Zara asked me to join this panel to further dip our toes into the murky pool that is provenance. So provenance is the history of ownership or custodianship or the whereabouts of works of art. And I'm going to tell you another story involving Robert Clive, one not directly linked to Powis, that demonstrates why provenance research is so important, but also how it's often frustrating and difficult and sometimes raises more questions than it gives us answers. So my work for the Royal Collection involves a lot of provenance research, and I spend my time delving into the Royal Archives at Windsor, as well as the East India in the British Library. And among the exciting discoveries that I've made have been the letters and drafts of letters and translations of letters sent to and from Shah Alam, the Mughal Emperor, and the British King George III, all dating from the 1760s and the 1770s. So these letters refer to gifts sent by Shah Alam to George III, but they also reveal how Robert Clive really didn't want these to reach the king. And it's the story of these gifts that I'm going to share with you today. And rather than telling it from the view of Clive, I'm going to tell it mainly from the points of view of Shah Alam and George III. So our story starts in 1765 in the Mughal fortress at Allahabad. The Mughal emperor is 37 years old and he's really fed up because a year earlier, his armies lost a battle against the East India Company. And the result of that, he had to make this unpleasant man called Robert Clive the governor of Bengal. So Bengal was the most prosperous region of Shah Alam's empire, and it was Indian cotton production. So cotton was the main industry, and until then, the main source of wealth, of Shah Alam's wealth. But now he's had to hand over full control of Bengal and all its tax revenues to Robert Clive. And in return, Clive has agreed to give him an annual stipend from the Bengal tax revenues, and he's been allowed to live under British protection here in the fort at Allahabad. Alam spent the first 25 years of his life in prison, so he's developed quite good self-control, and he enjoys studying literature and poetry and things like that. But he wants more than anything to go back to Delhi, the Mughal capital. His mother is there, and his son is there acting as regent, and several of his other sons are there. But the problem is that in his absence, some Afghans have taken over Delhi. So he asks Robert Clive if the company's armies will escort him back and help him get rid of them. But Clive tells him, no, sorry, we can't do that, it's too risky. Besides, he said, we, the East India Company, can't tell our armies to do anything without having received commands from the British king, which is obviously a lie, but he says it anyway. So Shah Alam decides that the only thing to do is to send an ambassador with a letter and with presents to the British king. And he writes this letter in which he entreats George to send 5,000 or 6,000 troops so that under Clive's command, they may conduct him to Delhi and restore him to the Mughal throne. And he ends the letter, as is the established custom of this country, whenever a letter is sent, to accompany it with a few curiosities, I therefore send you our illustrious brother and our gracious sister, the Lady Begum, meaning of course Queen Charlotte, a few trifles by way of remembrance. And listed in a document in the British Library are descriptions of these trifles. They include a large diamond pendant on a string of pearls, a gold enameled casket on a tray, both studded with diamonds, a dagger with a diamond encrusted jasper hilt, with a diamond encrusted scabbard, and a diamond encrusted sword, and a golden shield with a beckle bolt, also set with diamonds. So a lot of bling, no? But crucially, the gift also included a nazra, so a tribute of 100,000 rupees, so over £1 million in today's money. And under Mughal protocol, should George III accept this, it would make Shah Alam the British king's dependent and put him under British royal protection. Now, Shah Alam's treasury obviously had difficulty amassing this cash, but he eventually manages it. And a year later, he sends an embassy to England. And he appoints an Englishman called Archibald Swinton to lead his mission. And he also sends a member of his own court called Mirza Sheikh Itizamuddin. And in January 1766, they set sail from Calcutta. So what do you think happens next? Well, after a week at sea, Swinton and Itizamuddin are shocked to discover that neither Shah Alam's letter, nor his gifts, nor his tribute money are on board. But it's all right, they're told. Robert Clive has got them. And he's going to bring them to London when he returns next year, and he'll make sure that George gets them. And it's fine because he's bringing gifts from the Nawab of Arcot too, so he'll definitely give them. But they're advised that it would be best not to tell anyone in London about their mission from Shah Alam, because it would only make the Mughal emperor look bad, arrive empty-handed. So Swinton and Itizamuddin are fuming, and Itizamuddin writes in his diary from this time, which was later published, that Swinton's hunches were right. What he thought came true. Lord Clive deceived us. Meanwhile, Shah Alam is in Allahabad, and he's waiting. And he waits, and he waits, and he waits, and he has nothing. And a year goes by, and he hears that his deputy, the Nawab of Arcot, has received a thank you letter for his gifts and a complimentary present from the King of England. And he wonders why he, the emperor, has had no such reply. So by now, Shah Alam is really quite annoyed. Although he doesn't want to show it, he eventually to make his annoyance known to the British resident in Allahabad. And soon the British resident writes to the East India Company Court of Directors in London, and he says that the Great Mughal is disconcerted, easy, that the letter and presents, he hasn't received an answer, nor any acknowledgement of the presents and letter that he sent more than 2 years ago. And he goes on to say, this observation His Majesty has indeed made to me several times, but as it was rather slightly hinted, I had hitherto passed it over in the hopes of seeing some notice taken of the very valuable marks of affection from Shah Alam to His Britannic Majesty. Now, this is the first East India Company directors sitting in their London headquarters have ever heard of this. So they immediately write to Robert Clive and ask him what it's all about. And Clive writes back and says, yes, the Great had committed to my care a valuable present to the King of England and also one to the Queen, together with Her Majesty. And I accordingly presented them at a private audience with which I was honoured a few days after my arrival in England. But he notes that the bad state of his health soon obliged him to go to the south of France, and that he asked 2 colleagues to arrange the king's response. He goes on. As my memory does not furnish me with every particular that passed on that occasion, how or why that compliment from His Majesty to the Emperor of Hindustan was omitted, it is not in my power to inform you. So what's he saying? He's telling them, yes, I delivered 2 gifts to the King and Queen, so not the number that we've just seen in that list. But he says, I left it to my friends to arrange a response, so I don't know anything more. It's nothing to do with me. But the problem is that George III finds out. And he's really annoyed because he remembers Clive giving him the letter and can't understand why no one has arranged the appropriate and timely response. And his Secretary of State writes, Majesty has expressed great surprise and concern at the very negligent manner in which it appears that the Emperor of Hindustan has been treated. and gave me immediate orders to inquire very particularly into the real state of this affair. And George drafts a letter to be sent to Shah Alam, and we still have the draft of this letter. And he orders 2 full-length paintings of himself and of Queen Charlotte to send with it. And realizing the delicacy of the situation, he gives the instruction, take care to send some person of prudence and discretion with the letter and pictures to the Mughal. So George III is understandably really annoyed. You know, when you think you have the structure and systems in place to delegate certain tasks, but then someone doesn't do their job and it makes you look bad. This is what he's thinking. But he's also worried about what the East India Company are actually up to. All the conflicts that the company's armies are entering into in India. And although he acknowledges that India is a great commercial support to Britain, he believes that the safest future for all British interests abroad lay in not war. And that meant getting on with all its rulers, including the Mughal Emperor. So George's paintings arrive at the East India Company offices in London, and they're all ready to send to Shah Alam. And in the director's notes, they write, "We apprehend that these are intended as part of a present to the Mughal Shah Alam. But His Majesty has not yet acquainted us what his royal will and pleasure is with respect to this matter." And this is the last time the paintings are ever mentioned. And they seem never to have left England. And George III's letter appears never to have left England either. So someone in the East India Company has made a conscious decision to block the king's response. So poor Shah Alam is being ignored. He's being ignored, and he never forgets this lack of response from George. Because in 1777, 12 after he sent them, he brings up the gifts in a letter to MP, who's just been appointed the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Calcutta. So Shah Alam is writing because the company has stopped paying his stipend, and he wants to express all of his anger at the new so-called Chief Justice at what he sees as British hypocrisy. He doesn't think that he's been treated with justice, and he feels really betrayed by the East India Company and, of course, by Clive. And he asked MP to write a cover letter himself and to attach it to this one to forward on to King George. And in the letter, Shah Alam sarcastically writes, "We conclude that possibly it may not be customary for kings of England to reply to letters or to acknowledge the receipt of presents. Possibly it is the English custom to act in the manner in which the English chiefs have acted." And referring to his funds being cut off, he goes on to describe that the East India Company officials will not take the cotton of neglect out of their ears. And he signs off with this: "We expect an answer." So what really happened to Shah Alam's gifts? Well, the East India Company's Bengal account books from that time suggest that his 100,000 rupee tribute never even left India and was in fact added to their accounts under the heading of contribution money. But what about, so here's the list that I showed you earlier. I said before that this sort of research raises a lot of questions. So are we to assume that Clive kept all but 2 of the gifts that he claimed to have given to George and Charlotte? How do we even know that the 2 gifts he gave them were among those on this original list? You also said at the beginning that I still haven't found what I'm looking for, and that this research was frustrating. And that's because so far there is no sign of any of the gifts as described in this list in the collections at Windsor or in our historic inventory. So, as a post-seminar activity for any historians or art historians who are interested, particularly for Kieran and his interns at Torch. My task for you all now is to go back to this list and search through the Clive collections at Powis, search the inventories and the sales catalogues to see if we can find Alam's missing presence. Thank you.